Okay, guys. Today we're going to tackle our final module in the first part of unit. Can somebody grab the door? In unit 5. I'm sorry, unit 5. Okay. This last unit is all about language. Has anybody here ever studied language before? Any elements of language? Creative writers? Anybody study language? No. No. Okay. Um, So today we're just going to do like an overview of language and talk about some of the theories behind language. What is language? Yes, it is human communication. Good. What else does it involve? Anybody? Okay, good. Words or signs like ASL. Okay, Grace? Okay, good. And what was the first part? I'm sorry, you said something spoken? Written, spoken, or assigned. Okay. Is there anything that falls into another category? What about unspoken? Sure. Yeah, sure. Nonverbal. That's what we call it. Nonverbal communication. Just take a look at me right now. What am I communicating? I'm sad, yeah. For those of you at home, you can't see my frowny face. Okay, so ultimately, the main goal of communication is to convey meaning or to communicate. How many of you have ever heard that most of human communication is nonverbal? Okay, well, now you can all raise your hands because you've just heard it. Most of human communication is nonverbal. Some people estimate it to be about 60%, and it would vary, but it would vary. But we'll take a look at that today. Ultimately, there was a scientist that studied language pretty in depthly for a career path, and basically comes up with an informal rule for assessing the amount of the different categories of language. And that rule is the 55-38-7%. 55-38-7. Now, this is not necessarily something you need to worry about memorizing for the test. I just thought it was interesting. And how it breaks down is that 55% of our language is non-verbal, approximately. Okay, this means facial expression. Okay, this means body language, body posture. If I slunch over when I'm speaking to other people, what kind of a meaning could that convey to those other people? If you slunch over like, Ava, okay, maybe I don't want to talk to them. Good. What else? Having a bad day? Maybe I got a backache. Okay, what else is going on? Kira, what do you think? Like if I'm all hunched over talking to you like this, possibly upset, defeated. Okay, any of those things would be accurate potential assumptions. Um, what about I come in with a smile on my face? Happy, excited. I'm anticipating something that's joyful. Okay. Now, I want to look at this 38% right here. This one throws students off a little bit. 55% nonverbal. Okay. This means not dealing with sound or signed words. Sound or signed, meaning the words that I'm speaking to you now are like, I love you in sign language. All right. Those don't count. Vocal, about 38% are vocal. What does this mean? Why is that different than words? Very good. It's tonation is what it is. It's the fluctuation in my voice, okay, when I speak. Think about the next time you're talking to your friend, maybe later today or maybe later in this class. Pay attention to how you use the fluctuation in your voice when you speak. Now, some people do speak more monotone. They don't change the tone in their voice at all when they speak to other people, but you sound like a computer. Okay, it's a little weird. Almost everybody fluctuates. If they can speak, oftentimes we fluctuate our voice. Most of the times we fluctuate our voice. This is the part that I find that students find most interesting. Only 7% of our communication, we actually use our vocabulary, our spoken words. How many of you actually consciously pay attention to every single facial feature or every single gesture, every single piece of body posture that a person does when they're communicating with you? Every single one? Okay. Most of us do pay attention. Like obviously if Amelia was to walk up to me and Amelia was like frowny face, I would say, okay, Amelia's having a bad day. Okay, sad about something. All right. But I may not, a lot of times this happens automatically. When you get close to a person, your body just kind of like absorbs all of their mannerisms, like all of their nonverbal features. And then when they speak to you, your body kind of takes in the tonation in their voice. If you're really excited about something and you just can't wait to get to it, go, 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 go. Okay, you'll speak in a higher pitch, usually a little more rapid. But if you're sad and you're kind of tired, you've had a bad day, you ran over a cat on your way to school. I know it's horrible, sorry. You're going to have usually a lower, slower voice. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right. So the elements of spoken language, we're going to tear it down to the very basic bits. Okay. This is actually kind of interesting. I'm going to take you back to probably like kindergarten, maybe even preschool a little bit. You guys ready for some regression, as Freud would call it? Go back in time to a previous age. Have you ever heard of phonemes? Some of us? Good. Phonemes. Phonemes are the smallest individual unit of language. Okay? And these are comprised of small sounds. So think of it like when you were in elementary school and you were learning how to read, or maybe even before that, like preschool, and the teacher was helping you or your parents were helping you sound out certain parts of word like C-A-T, k-a-t, cat. Okay, the word cat has how many phonemes? 3. That one's an easy one. Cat, bat, those all have 3. Okay. All right. Let's graduate just a little bit more and go to the next one. What about phone? The word phone. O-n, phone. How many phonemes? 3 again. Okay. But keep in mind, don't confuse phonemes with letters. Sometimes individual letters equal a full phoneme. Sometimes, like a P and an H, gives you that f sound in phone, or fat, as in PH, fat. Okay? No? My dad jokes are missing the mark this morning. Okay. The next largest, still pretty small though, the next largest chunk of language is called a morpheme. This one's easy. Actually, they're both easy. I'm going to give you some memory strategies to remember the two. But morpheme conveys a meaning. Okay, how many phonemes, not morphemes, how many phonemes in the word bat? 3. B, a, t, bat. Okay, how many morphemes in the word hats? Somebody said it already. 2, very good. 2. Can you explain why and how? Very good. Yeah. So you actually have 2 morphemes. There's 2 chunks of the word hat that convey meaning. The singular hat, H-A-T, is a one hat, uno hat. Okay? But when you add S, it now makes it plural. So there's 2 morphemes, there's 2 meanings inside the word hats. The singular with an S on the end, it's plural. Does everybody follow me? Okay. All right. So here is cats. The word cat has two morphemes. The first morpheme is the word cat. The second, you add the S, it means more than one kitty. Okay? Think of morphemes being the addition of prefixes and suffixes to a word. Think of a word that has both a prefix and a suffix. Misinformed. Misinformed. How many morphemes? 3. Miss, M-I-S. Miss is the front part of the prefix, meaning to incorrectly. Inform, obviously, is informed. And then informed with the D at the end, the ED at the end makes it what? Past tense. It's already happened. 3 morphemes to the word misinformed. Okay? Questions? We feel okay? I know it's very basic grammatical stuff, but most of us, it's been a minute since we talked about grammar, unless, of course, you have Morelli, right? Don't tell him I told you that. Okay, moving on. All right, let's talk about the larger parts of language. And yes, if you're curious as to what this GIF is, this is a fat white cat. And the fat white cat plays a role in this slide. So get excited if you like cats. I don't know, it's very, very heavy on the cat references today already. Like we're only 3 slides in, it's amazing. Hit a cat, cat and cats. Now we have a fat white cat. Okay, grammar. Grammar is basically a large category that contains all of the rules of how we share words. Within grammar, there are 2 smaller elements that we need to know. Okay, semantics. Semantics is simply, are we communicating the proper words for understanding? Okay, if I want to pay Eliza a compliment on Eliza's hair today, if I said, Eliza, your shoe looks amazing this morning. Okay, I'm not conveying the proper meaning. The semantics of what I'm trying to say is incorrect. I'm conveying one message, but I intend to convey another. Think of semantics as basic understanding. Okay, you have to use the right words in order to convey the proper meaning. Now, in the English language, this gets a little tricky from time to time. And I'm going to go back to a previous example. We talked about Halloween. All right. What was that word I had? Did anybody in here spell the witch for me? Who was it? Gwenny, that's right. And Gwenny fell into the trap, W-I-T-C-H. But how many different ways can we spell witch? Good. There's 2, possibly 3. Okay, and those are going to be not homonym. What's the same sound? Whatever they are, they sound the same. Is it homonym? Homophone. Homophone, that's what I meant. Okay, so anyway, so you have which, W-I-T-C-H. You have which as in which one, W-H-I-C-H. And then, like Grace said, the tail end of sandwich, even though it's part of a larger word, it still has that exact same sound. So if you're learning the English language, you have to learn those nuances of all the different ways to spell the word which. Another one. When you, what do you do with the book? What's the past tense of that? How do you spell that differently? You don't. It's exactly the same, is it not? R-E-A-D is the same as R-E-A-D. The present tense of read a book is also the same as the past tense, read a book. The word itself is spelled exactly the same, but it's the way we pronounce it and the way we use it that makes it different. That involves syntax, the grammatical use or the rules that govern how we arrange our words and how we use those words. Does anybody in here habla en español todo tiempo? ¿Sí? No, un poco? Yes. Okay, good. All right. We have some people doing the fancy hands. All right, this is a fat white cat. How do we habla en España? How do we say that in Spanish? Very good. El gato blanco gordo. El gato blanco gordo. So I told you it had a reason here. In English, we say the fat, comma, white. There probably should be another comma there. Cat. The fat white cat. Now that's not a sentence, but it doesn't matter. Okay. But in Spanish, we say el gato blanco gordo. The cat white fat. Syntax can vary from language to language, and oftentimes it does. But all languages, in order to be a language, must have syntax. Syntax is a set of rules that govern where your nouns go, where your question marks go, where your modifiers go, like adjectives, adverbs, all these things. Comprendo? Todo? Muy inteligente. Oh, yeah. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody need more time? Okay. Look at that big old fat cat. He's like, I think I need to have a seat right here. Okay, moving on. All right, this one gets kind of into a sad part of psychology here. At first, we're going to talk about critical periods. This is a really important concept that we're going to circle back to when it comes to like developmental psychology. Critical periods are any developmental stage in a human being's life that usually occur within a specific age. Many of these occur during childhood. Okay, it can be anything from developing language, using language, which is what we're going to focus on today, or it could be learning how to walk. There are milestones for learning how to walk. There are critical periods for creating what we call social bonds. You okay? Yes. Okay. Social bonds. And today we're going to also talk about the forbidden experiment. Ava, you look scared. Don't worry, it'll be okay, I promise. It's actually really sad. But okay. So when we take this concept of critical period and we apply it to language, basically it's the idea that human beings must learn the core elements of a language within a certain window. Now, most old beliefs believe that language must be learned, whether it's a first language, your primary language, or a secondary or a third language, must be learned between the ages of 2 to puberty. Now, this is kind of an old school thought, and I'm going to talk to you about why it's an old school thought. And you probably heard me talk about my distaste for the idea that American schools teach language at the high school level. Many do. By the time you guys hit high school, puberty for you is like at the tail end, okay? In fact, many of you reach your sexual maturation in the early years of high school, okay? Now that can vary from person to person, but when that closes, and I don't like to say that you can't learn language, but it's a lot harder. Have you guys ever had a parent that spoke only one language and that in their mid to late 20s or later learned a second language? Kind of. Was it a lot of work, and did they speak fluently? Okay, that's good. It's a rarity to find an adult that can learn a language. Not saying it can't happen, but it takes a lot of work. Like for me to learn a new language, because I was never brought up bilingual, for me to learn a new language, it would be really challenging. It would take a lot of effort, especially to learn it to the point where I could go and communicate fairly fluently with a foreign language speaker. Okay. Now, 2 years to puberty. The reason I highlighted this is because there's new data coming out that suggests that window may actually be almost all the way up until what we would call like legal adulthood, like ages 17 to 18, which would provide some argument for teaching language at the high school level. But the problem is that in order for a student to be able to learn a language fluently, and even to learn a second language, because a lot of times when we look at this critical period, we're looking at it in the aspect of learning a second language, because so many of us learn our primary language fairly quickly and early on. We look at it as like learning another language. But if you don't learn syntax in that second language by age 10, it becomes incredibly hard. And again, if you look at the English example I gave you of the fat white cat versus the Spanish syntax, the syntax is very different. And for you to be able to learn Spanish much easier, you would have to have learned the Spanish syntax up to the age of 10. After 10, it becomes much more difficult. Does that make sense what I'm saying? You've got like a sweet spot to learn language. Now, we'll talk about some examples in life that are really sad, and we call them the feral children cases. Have you guys heard of the feral children or feral child? I've told you about Jeannie, I think, probably several times. We're going to look at Jeannie Wiley's case, and it's a really sad case. All these cases are fairly sad. All right, anyway, statistical learning. This basically, guys, is a concept that in order for adults to learn a language, they have to tap into what we call statistical learning. And it's much harder for adults to tap into language-based statistical learning after that critical period, whether it ends at puberty or whether it ends at 17 or 18. Regardless of that, if adults don't learn a second language by the time they hit either puberty or 17 or 18, it's going to be much harder for them. They have to repeat something and turn it into an automatic process using statistical learning. Was anybody in here raised in a bilingual family? If you want to share, kind of. Okay. We're going to talk about the bilingual advantage here in just a minute. How about right now? Children that are raised in a bilingual family, and by the way, if you ever want to have children and you're considering, if you value having like the child speak more than one language, start them early. The earlier, the better. It may mean that you need also to brush up on your second language if that's the one you want to teach the child. But children that learn two languages or more language, multilingual, while they are in that critical period, regardless of when it starts and stops, their ability to learn additional languages after the typical critical period ends is exponentially better than those that have only learned the one language. Even if you were in a so-so bilingual household, like where you learned a little bit, and you spoke a little bit fluently, like that will give you an advantage to pick up another language later down the road. Think of it like during that window, you learn the ability to learn language, okay? Especially beyond your primary language. So if you can learn two languages during that critical period, you now have the ability to learn additional languages. And it'll take some effort, but it'll be far less difficult than somebody that only grew up with one language. Okay, again, I just threw this up here. The statistical learning part is where the adults just have problems. Like they really have to force it. So to see an adult that can acquire a brand new language fluently after the critical period has ended, it's a rarity. It doesn't mean it can't happen. There are people that do it. Like otherwise, like Rosetta Stone and all these other companies would be out of business. There are people that do it. It requires exponentially more work usually. Okay, questions? A lot of linguistic theorists and psychologists believe that the problem lies in the syntax. So if you don't learn the syntax of another language in that critical period, then it's a problem. I know I'm throwing a lot of big words at you guys early in the morning. I apologize. Okay, does anybody have any questions on this? Does everybody kind of understand what I'm saying here? Yeah? Okay. Anybody need more time? Okay, so before we get into the sad news, let's talk about the milestones of language. There's really only about 4 of them that you need to worry about. All right, so the stages of language. Now, these can vary slightly depending on the development of the child. I know my wife and I are looking at this with our son. You know, we're when we I'm probably more cognizant of this because I teach this than my wife, but you know, we've talked about doing bilingual stuff. We've talked about making sure that the child is at developmentally appropriate stages. Babbling, usually by 4 months, we see babbling begin. I'll tell you right now, my son's babbling already. At like, he turns 2 months next week, I think. So, but it's more like cooing and gaga, like it's not really tangible words. It's not like mama, dada, kitty. Like it's not real words. It's just sounds. But keep in mind from our last unit, we talked about the importance of mirror neurons and learning and modeled behavior. So that child, my son or whatever child that's learning language and is only a couple months old, they're watching adults speak. So like, who's a good little baby? Who's a good? So when you're making those sounds, the child sees the mouth move. So when you make that O or ah or t sound, the child sees the mouth. And oftentimes the child will try in their own, usually much slower way, to mimic those facial gestures. That does a couple things. It strengthens the tongue and it strengthens other facial muscles necessary in used in forming words, other than just ah. That's a pretty easy one. You don't really need a lot of facial muscles, just a good throat muscle to cry. And children do that a lot too. All right, babbling stage. You can actually take this and go from like 4 months to 10 months. It's a window. 4 months to about 10 months, maybe 12-ish. You okay? Okay. The rest are pretty easy. How many months in a year? 12. So the one word stage happens at 1 year or 12 months. How many months in 2 years? 24. Okay, the two word stage happens at 2 years, roughly. And then after that, we see what we call telegraphic speech. This is where I go from just saying me hungry to like, I would like to eat now. Usually that jump happens very quickly. Once telegraphic speech has been attained by the child, me hungry, pretty kitty, whatever. Okay, again with the cats. What's going on today? Oh yeah, probably because I saw that. After 24 months, usually very rapidly, the child will form telegraphic speech. Telegraphic speech is where we're at. Okay, it's where we convey meaning fairly fluently to another person. Not only can we convey it, but we can also interpret it and comprehend it when it's spoken back to us. Mason set up. All right, does anybody have any questions on this? All right, you ready for some sad stuff? Okay. It's interesting but sad. We're going to talk about the forbidden experiment. Does anybody need more time on this slide? Okay. And again, all this is in your textbook and on Canvas. So we've talked about Jeannie. Can anybody tell me the story of Jeannie real quick? Good. Yeah. She was found by Children's Services at age 13 and 9 months, so almost 14. And her parents, her dad probably had mental issues, most likely had mental issues. He struggled with loud sounds, even though they had other children. At about 20 months, they took Jeannie and they basically threw her in her crib and put her in the closet and left her there for the next 13 years. They either kept her chained to the toilet or locked into the toilet, or they kept her locked in her crib. They never really spoke with her. So she, in essence, becomes what we call the forbidden experiment. And the forbidden experiment is this, and ethics would never allow this to happen, which is why it's called the forbidden experiment. You take a newborn baby, you place them in a room, and you confine them from any and all human contact, other than like, somehow feeding them. But ethically, we could never do this. So people, you don't figure out how you can make something that you're not going to do happen. But unfortunately, Jeannie's scenario, along with there's a handful of others, and it's almost always children because adults are fully formed. Okay, children, on the other hand, we always try to look at that big nature versus nurture argument. Is it what the child is born with, or is it how nature impacts them? And with language, language is tricky because it's elements of both. Okay, done? Okay, so let's talk about some of these feral children and what happens when you miss critical periods. Okay, in particular, we're going to focus on language today, but there are other critical periods. Attachment. Attachment. Did anybody do Harry Harlow in the 40 Studies book? Harry Harlow and his rhesus monkeys. So Harry Harlow actually carries out the forbidden experiment, but he does it on monkeys. Unfortunately, all of the monkeys that he uses in the experiment eventually have to be euthanized if they don't die during the experiment. But what he found was not only is there a critical period of language, there's also a critical period of attachment. Okay, and we'll talk about that when we get to developmental psychology. Okay, so there are a handful of these children. Victor of Avignon. Okay, Victor of Avignon, sometimes called the wild boy of Avignon. This was a case that happened in the late 1700s, early 1800s. They found this boy. Can somebody grab the door, please? They found this boy running wild in the forests of France, being raised by a pack of wolves. Yes. Sorry. I meant to just write, missing a critical period can cause delays, developmental delays. Thank you, Calvin. Okay, so Oksana Malaya. Oksana Malaya was a Russian child who had alcoholic and abusive parents. They basically threw her outside in the cage with dogs, and she was basically raised by feral dogs. Well, not by feral dogs, but like domesticated dogs. She had to stay near the dogs for warmth because this was Russia, and it's not exactly the warmest. So she is a rare case because she she displays a lot of very odd behaviors, and we'll maybe watch a little bit of that behavior, but you can see her here. She basically learns how to like bark like a dog, and she behaves like a dog, walks on all fours when she was found. Now, she is now like in her 20s, and she's made an amazing recovery, but she still has to live in a home for the mentally incapacitated. Okay, so even though her case is like an amazing outcome for where she's at, because a lot of people don't do as well as she does. She learns a very high level of. She's able to acquire language, which is very odd for somebody her age. Because Jeannie, on the other hand, Jeannie Wiley, a case coming out of California, she was the one that was found by Children's Services. She was, locked in her crib and chained to the toilet. Her parents basically never socially interacted with her. When she was found at almost age 14, she could only say just a few basic words. That was the limit of her language at age 13, 14. And for a lot of you guys, like that was what, last year, year before? Okay. She had like 3 words in her vocabulary. Hot, cold, hungry. It was pretty much limited to that. Yes. Because she had an element of socialization with the dogs, or she could have had more social interaction with her parents. Alcoholics usually don't have a very good recollection of how they interact or don't interact. And the trauma of these events, Oksana may have had more social interaction, which caused her to be more advanced in her language acquisition. It's possible. I'm not an expert on the case, so but yeah, or she could have learned from the dogs, because dogs do have communication. It's nonverbal. Sometimes it's oh, woof. Okay. All right, so just a quick couple minutes with Oksana's case, and then we'll move on. We'll watch a little bit of Jeannie's case. I got to change the volume. Hold on 1 second. And I will say this is a little disturbing. So if you feel like you might have an issue with it, you do not have to watch this if you don't want to watch. Both Jeannie and Oksana's video are a little disturbing, so don't feel like you absolutely have to watch this. Okay, folks at home, you can watch this on your own. You won't have any sound, so I'm going to pause you for just a moment. We'll be back in a second. But unfortunately for Jeannie, she plateaued after about, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 months, 6 months, something like that, and she stopped developing. She didn't go any farther. Today, we don't really know a lot about Jeannie because her mother and she had a brother or a sister that was still alive. They were kind of giving the public information about Jeannie. She lives in an assisted care facility somewhere in the greater Los Angeles area. We don't know if she's still alive anymore. Anyway, we just know that when the research on Jeannie stopped, she was speaking at about a 5th grade level. Okay. About 10 years old. That was the max. That's like after years of intensive occupational therapy and speech therapy. But she just couldn't get beyond that level. So anyway, that's the forbidden experiment, basically seeing how a small child would react if you completely remove them from human contact. Okay. Unfortunately, these feral children give us a real life scenario that can be studied through their tragedy. Okay. And there's a lot of feral children. There were a set of twin girls in India that were raised by wolves. Like you see a lot of wolf raising going on in the feral child community. Anyway, any questions on this? Okay. Aphasia. We've talked a little bit about aphasia. We've talked about Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So aphasia is basically any type of impairment of language. Please make sure you understand that. It's a generic term. There's actually multiple specific types of aphasia, but the two you need to worry about, bless you, it's a good way to hurt yourself. Okay, Broca's area. Broca's area is responsible for the creation of spoken language. So whenever you go to speak, you're using your Broca's area. When you are listening, you're using Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is essential for the comprehension of language. Broca's area, both of these lie in the left hemisphere. That key aspect is really important. The left side of our brain handles speech, unless it's a unique scenario where you've had hemispherectomy or brain damage and somehow the brain has rewired itself, which has happened. Rare, but it has happened. Broca's area is at the back end of the frontal left lobe, the left frontal lobe. Okay, Wernicke's area is at the rear on the left side of the temporal lobe, or that middle lobe of the brain that wraps the thalamus. So each one of these, damage to either one of these areas can cause an aphasia. Each aphasia is slightly different. Broca's aphasia means that you could understand what I'm saying to you, but if you go to try to speak back to me, nothing comes out. Your brain cannot put words together and speak them. So an easy way to remember Broca's aphasia, your speech is broken or broken speech. You can't talk. Wernicke's area is where I can speak to you, and if you have Wernicke's aphasia, you will not understand the words coming out of my mouth. It will sound like Charlie Brown's parents. Okay? You've never seen Charlie Brown, that's what his parents sound like. Okay? Now, a couple unique elements of this. Songs, previously learned songs, musical tunes that have words added in can bypass aphasia because music is handled in which side of the brain? What's the opposite of your left? Very good. The right, yes. The right hemisphere. Okay. Also, another interesting side note about these aphasias. Folks that are deaf and rely on ASL or severely hearing impaired, if they have an aphasia, also, it can impair their ability to sign. Not physically make the signs, but to comprehend the signs that they're making. So it's a unique, rare thing. But you guys know who Bruce Willis is, right? Bruce Willis, about 2 years ago, bless you, or cough this time. Okay. So Bruce Willis, a couple years ago, was actually diagnosed with aphasia. They now know that aphasia was an early symptom of prefrontal lobe dementia. Okay, and it was affecting his ability to create speech. It's actually progressed pretty significantly. He's kind of gone downhill. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody need more time on this? Okay. So one of the big questions, and this is one of the last questions that we're going to tackle today, is does language impact thought, and can you have language without thought, or does language require thought? Which comes first? Think about that. Like, can you have a thought without words? But does it have meaning if you can't describe whatever it is you're thinking about? Explain. If you're what? I'm sorry. Okay. Like images. Okay. But can you describe those images? Does the image have value for you if you didn't have any words to describe that image? Okay. Okay. That's the big argument. Can we have thoughts without language, and can we have language without thoughts? Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, and his theory of language acquisition. He basically says all humans have the ability to learn language. It's innate. Almost there. All humans have the ability to learn language. It's part of our evolutionary past. He also gives us this idea of universal grammar. And he makes the argument that every culture, or every language, even if they vary greatly, like for example Arabic. Okay, Arabic is in a lot of ways very opposite of English. English, we read right to left, top to bottom. Arabic, you start on the right and read to the left. Okay. Anyway, the point is that every language has the ability, as an example, to ask a question. Okay, so all languages share that in common. If you want to watch more about Chomsky and his idea of universal grammar, you can watch this little video. It's only about 3 minutes. Everybody getting this? All right, so that's Chomsky's theory of language acquisition and universal grammar. Everybody good? More time. Okay. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Benjamin Whorf and Edward Sapir. These two guys got together. Sapir actually created the theory first, and Whorf really turns it into a published work. So it's referred to as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And it's the idea, it's called linguistic determinism. Okay, linguistic determinism basically states that language dictates the way we think. Okay, it determines, it's everything. Like our language and the languages that we learn dictate what we know and what we understand. And the reason they originally present this idea of linguistic determinism is because of this group of people right here. This woman, this is a picture of a woman from the Hopi Native American tribe that lived in the southwest of the United States. The Hopi, in their language, their native language, have no word for past tense. So, like, I took notes today. Well, you took, that doesn't mean anything to them. There's no past tense. Their idea of chronological time is very different than most other people living in this country. And that their idea, the Whorf hypothesis, basically says is that because, according to linguistic determinism, because the Hopi have no word or no concept of past tense, they don't understand past tense. Does anybody have a problem with that? I mean, it's odd, yes, but do you think you could go ahead, Grace?
Well, maybe if we're talking to them and trying to explain, the past tense, just because they can't comprehend what that is in language because they don't have that in their native language, doesn't mean they don't have a sense of past.
Good. Exactly. And that's why linguistic determinism is considered to be mostly incorrect to a degree. A more accepted interpretation of Whorf's theory is called linguistic relativism. It's not that our language dictates all of our understanding. It's the fact that language and what the words that we know influences the way we interpret our world. Unfortunately, because throughout history, many cultures, most cultures, have been typically male dominated, we come across a lot of sexist language. Can anybody give me an example and keep it appropriate, please? I gave you 3 examples up there. Fireman, policeman, mailman, Iron Man. It's very sexist. Okay? And we still use the terminology today. Okay? Say, why not fire person or fire woman? Technically, that's the way it should be, right? Male woman, male man. But our understanding of the word male man changes when you turn it into male woman. Okay? And if you're not spelling out M-A-I-L woman, male woman, M-A-L-E woman, becomes confusing. Okay? All right. A couple more examples about how language can influence the way we think. Down here in the bottom left, what is this picture of? Ice cubes. Ice cubes. The middle picture, reindeer. And the final picture is just kind of a snowy landscape. So the native peoples, the Native American peoples of the far north, the Yupik tribes and the Inuit, we would kind of incorrectly call them Eskimos. Okay? They have 70 words for different types of ice. Frozen ice, ice that stays around all year. Thin ice, thick ice. Like they and why is that, Julia, do you think? Why do they have 70 words for ice? Yeah, and they live surrounded by ice most of the year. Now, here in South Carolina, we don't experience a lot of this unless it's in a drink. Okay? We have one word really, ice. Like, anybody think of other words that you would use to describe ice other than like fringe words that would be like precipitation or something like sleet or freezing rain or icicle, which we don't see a lot of. Okay, we don't have other words, which means when we think of the topic of ice, our brains are a little more narrow compared to the native indigenous people of the north. Reindeer. There's a group of northern folks that live in Russia called the Stem people, or no, the Samti. Anyway, very similar to the North American Yupik and Inuit tribes. They have over 1,000 words to describe or to classify reindeer. Over 1,000. A lot of words for a reindeer. Snow. There's another group of people in Russia that have, I want to say like 120 different words for snow. Like heavy snow, like tight little packed snow, almost like sleet. Okay, big fluffy snow, thin, very cold snow. Okay. Anyway, the whole point is that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis looks at how language can influence thought and how thought influences language. Does anybody have any questions? Last slide, done. Most current research, when we look at that argument of does language influence thought or does thought influence language, most of the research today says yes on both accounts. It's a cycle. As your proficiency for language goes up, you increase the amount of ability of thought. And if you think about like vocab, how many of you have a decent vocabulary? Decent vocabulary? Okay. Has it gotten better since you were 5 years old? Yeah, and the idea is as your brain grows and matures, so does your ability for language, so does your ability for expanded thought. That's it. We're done. Sorry, took you a little close to the end of the period, but hey, the last 5 minutes is all yours. All right, folks at home, if you haven't started reading the next unit, it's unit 11 in your textbook or modules 60 through 64. I want you to start reading module 60 over the weekend and come ready to talk about intelligence and intelligence testing and individual differences next class. Bye-bye.